Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to session 3A, Technological Design and Entanglements for People Aging in Place. This is a very important session since, as we all know, acceptance of assistive technologies by older people very largely depend on their acceptance, and that very much depends on the fact that their preferences and wishes in designing these facilities were considered by those designing them. We look forward to a wonderful session with three experts who have done a lot of research on these matters. I can introduce you to Tanja Ahlin, who is lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, who will now give a talk on calling India everyday digital technologies for elder care at a distance. And I invite you to a fascinating talk by Tanja. Tanja, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this wonderful introduction. So my name is Tanja Ahlin, and I'm an anthropologist and a science and technology scholar, STS scholar, and currently a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam. So my interest in technology for health and care was sparkled almost 10 years ago when I started to observe the rise of telemedicine and e-health projects all around the world. And as I attended professional conferences, I noticed that practically all projects that were being presented were focusing on some innovative, highly specialized new technology. And since then, I could see more and more funding being allocated from national and international agencies and governments towards telemedicine and e-health, and this has only increased in the times of the pandemic. So what was really fascinating was that all this money was going to technological innovations in formal healthcare. And this made me think, what about all the technology that is already out there that is easily available and also accessible to most people? So is that being used for the purposes of care? And if it is, how is that being done? So in my project, I explore everyday information and communication technologies such as mobile phones and webcams and how they are involved in care. So while I was looking for a good case study to explore care at a distance through everyday ICTs, I came across a phenomena called global care chains, which describes the migrating professional and non-professional carers, so people who migrate abroad to become carers for somebody, while they leave behind their own family members who might also be in need of care. So the literature on global care chains mostly describes what happens with children who are left behind by their mothers who migrate abroad as carers. And I decided to investigate another part of such transnational care, which is caring for the elderly parents who are left behind and who are often described in popular and academic discourse as being abandoned by their migrating children. Next slide, please. Because of my previous interest in and also experience with India, my case study became nurses from Kerala, which is a South Indian state, who migrate abroad for work, and they migrate all around the world. I conducted my field work at 2 field sites and through many field events. So my field site were Kerala and then Oman as one of the major destination countries for nurses from Kerala. And then I also contacted nurses who worked in other countries, and I did that through the phone and Skype and other digital technologies. And this gave rise to the concept of field events, which is very helpful to analyze how ICTs are not just tools that we use to reach our study participants at a distance, but also how these technologies shape our fieldwork in very specific ways. But this is a story for another time. So next slide, please. Drawing on material semiotics approach from STS care studies, I propose the concept of transnational care collectives to describe how technologies actively enter the informal care practices in Indian transnational families. So the transnational care collective consists of the parents who live in India, their children who migrate abroad, and different kinds of ICTs. And in this context, the families have to tackle different chronic illnesses such as diabetes and high blood pressure, but also mental health issues such as loneliness, isolation, and having to deal with discrimination. In each of the transnational care collectives, there is a particular dynamic that is established through tinkering, through daily tinkering, as people try to find out what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And then this dynamic also depends on which actors become involved. So who among the family members, and also which kinds of technologies become involved. And then another aspect is who calls whom, when, and how often that happens. Who and how takes care of the ICTs, because they also need care. They need to be provided with the electricity and money and so on. And another aspect of the transnational care collective is who else beyond the parents and the children becomes included. Sometimes this could be different siblings that still live nearby the parents, or this could be grandchildren, neighbors, and other people. Next slide, please. So here you can see some of the different types of ICTs that I came across in my fieldwork. You can see the tablets, the laptops, but most commonly people used mobile phones. So the children abroad often used smartphones, whereas for the parents, the very basic common mobile phones worked best. And this was, of course, because they were the most easy to use, but there were also other reasons. Next slide, please. So in a transnational care collective, where people are separated through geographic distance, care becomes about practices that can be done at a distance. So some practices such as living together and preparing food for another person, these are impossible, right? When you're physically separated from each other. So one practice that did work at a distance was, or rather is, calling through ICTs. But for such care to be considered good, it was not enough just to call. It was also important to call frequently. And among the families that I met, this frequency differed, but in most cases, the nurses abroad would call home every day, or sometimes often actually even more than once a day. So Anthony, who was a nurse first in the UK and then in Australia, he told me that he spoke to his parents every day on the phone, and he would talk to them for 10 or 15 minutes, but then not so often on Skype because his parents were not so good at using that technology. So when his brother was visiting them, then his brother would establish this connection, the Skype connection between him and his parents, and that happened only once in a few months. Different technologies also shape the contact and the content of the conversation, or of the interaction rather. So through the phone, people try to avoid silences. Silences are can be very uncomfortable, and they try to fill the silences by talking about the everyday things, the everyday life, such as what grows in the garden, how are the neighbors' children, how is the church, and so on. So in this way, they share their everydayness across large distances. But on the webcam, it's quite a different situation because people don't even have to talk at all. And silence can be a way to spend time together when we're physically separated. Next slide, please. The nurses that I worked with are quite specific as migrants because they are professional carers as well, and they can use their professional knowledge to provide healthcare informally to their family members. So, for example, Sarah told me that her parents often asked her first for advice that was related to medicines and so on, or to different health issues before they even contacted their doctor, their primary doctor. However, these nurses would rarely, if ever, talk to the doctors, the parents, health carers, directly. And that was out of respect for the local power hierarchies, but also it was out of fear because the nurses were actually afraid that if they intervened directly between the parents and their doctor, this might actually have a negative influence on their own relationship between the doctors and the parents. Next slide, please. So daily calls were particularly useful for nurses to monitor their parents' health in case of serious illnesses or chronic diseases. There was, for example, the family of Lucy, and her father had Parkinson's disease, and she called her mother every day in the morning after Lucy's night shift, and then in the evening before her night shift. And this is how, she always asked her mother for the details of her father's condition. She asked, well, I always know his mood. And then I asked, he had a particular wound at the time of our conversation. So she asked, is there any skin infection? How is his temperature? Can he move the leg? What is the color of the wound? So, and then she said the diagnosis. Okay, I have a picture now. I know what it is. And then she could also direct the treatment. And she said that she actually did that in the same way as she did it at work, because she was also practicing telemedicine at work. But she said that for her it worked much, much better because of the intimate relationship that she had with her parents. And she actually said, this is the only reason why this kind of care works at a distance, because we know each other so well, and I know exactly what is going on also between them. And that was also a bit different with her siblings. So her parents had a close daily conversations with her, but not with her other siblings who were also nurses working abroad. So maybe a bit surprisingly, but the phone worked just well in this case. They only used the phone for years. They had no need for the webcam. And the webcam, as I said, was more difficult sometimes because the parents didn't know how to use it well, but also because it had a higher emotional toil. So sometimes it was actually very difficult emotionally to see family members on the webcam and then not being able to be there in person. Next slide, please. Parents quite readily exchanged information about health through ICTs with their daughters, but with their sons, it was a bit different. I actually encountered parents who concealed health issues from their sons. So, for example, John, he worked in Guyana, and he only returned back home after 3 years there. And he called his parents every week, but yet he didn't see them for 3 years. So he was really surprised, first of all, to see how much they have aged. But also he discovered that his father had an accident. He broke his shoulder and he had to have an operation. So John didn't have any idea about that. They just didn't tell it to him. And I asked his mother, why didn't they share this information? And she said, well, why bother him? He would only be tense. That's why I didn't tell him. He is not very near to us to come running for help with help. So in this way, the mother was protecting her son from what she thought was unnecessary stress. And in some families, sons found their way around their parents trying to hide such information by engaging, for example, a good friend to regularly drop by their parents' home and bring along a smartphone or a tablet, and then to establish this webcam connection. And in this way, the sons would also be able to see the parents. By contrast, daughters had no need for such arrangements because none of the parents in my study ever said that they didn't want to bother their daughters with bad health news. Next slide, please. So briefly, I just want to mention that while I set out to study elder care in Indian transnational families, I came to realize that there was actually no such thing as just elder care. The care was always intergenerational as well. So I discovered that for nurses who lived alone in sometimes very harsh social conditions, which could include sexual and religious and racial discrimination, the daily calls with their family members in Kerala were also a self-care practice. So, for example, Joy, who lived in Saudi Arabia, for her, regular Skype calls with her mother were really very important for her own well-being. She said it makes her feel so happy to be able to see the food that her mother prepared, and it was not important that she couldn't touch it or that she couldn't taste it or smell it or whatever. It was just very helpful just to see it. So, final slide, please. This research has several implications. One of them is, well, there are implications for the family, for the sociality within the family, because this kind of care within the transnational care collectives influences the family dynamics in specific ways. It's also important that the professional knowledge does put nurses in a special position among migrants, but at the same time, the quality of the relationships matters as well. There are also implications for managing health and sociality beyond the family, because the nurses manage their parents' health conditions and yet they don't interfere with the local health carers. But perhaps most important for this panel, for policymakers and so on, this work is relevant because it also challenges the need for constant technological innovation and suggests that there might be untapped resources in the form of easily available and accessible everyday information and communication technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I learned a lot from it, and I'm sure you out there also did so. There will be time for questions in the end of this session, but now it's time to move on to the next speaker. And the next speaker will be Kate O'Loughlin of the University of Sydney, who many of you will know. She's been an expert in this field for many years. And without much further ado, the floor is yours, Kate, and we are looking forward to a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. And yes, I guess I have been working in this field for quite some time, as have you. And we have met over many years on this topic around aging and technology. So I'm presenting today, but I want to acknowledge my research collaborators, Dr. Meryl Lovarini and Professor Lindy Clemson. We are in the School of Health Sciences in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. So much of our research is looking at health and well-being. And you may be curious about the title, Moving Beyond the Shower Chair. And that is because an important part of our work is looking at the work of allied health professionals, particularly occupational therapists and physiotherapists and nurses, to consider, because they will be interacting and introducing interventions for people as they age, and we're wanting them to think beyond the usual, if you like, aids or assistive type technologies, such as a shower chair, which is most important, I have to say, but to think a little more broadly, hence the title of our presentation. Next slide, please. So the background to our work, we were funded by the university, internal funding, for the project Older Adults' Use of Technology to Successfully Age in Place. And the reason for this interest is, of course, the preference of older adults, Australian adults, and I'm sure around the world, to remain living in the community for as long as possible. The last thing they want is to go into any form of residential care, long-term care. So whatever supports we can provide to keep them in their own home is important to people as they age, but it is also of importance to the Australian national government, because aged care is a national responsibility, policy and fiscally. It is a national government area, and we have a very public policy statement around aging in place. And in fact, the funding of our aged care in Australia is very much centred on providing support to keep people living in the community to age in place. It is quite explicit in our policy and in the funding model we have, which is a consumer-directed care or personal budget type of funding. So that's the policy framework, but also we recognise the potential of technology. It is well recognised to improve lives of older people, but we talk about technology, we use the word technology very freely, but often we're not defining or explaining what it is. And when you have this conversation with older people, they don't often really understand what it is you're getting at. So the defining technology is still a challenge, and we don't know a lot about how, or in Australia at least, how older adults use technology for aging in place. It's not really clear. So with that in mind, we, in our project, our funded project, I'm reporting on two aspects of the project today. And next slide, please. So the first is a pilot study, if you like to put it that way, a small qualitative study with older people living in the community to explore their experiences, their understanding of what we mean about technology, and how useful they thought it was. Did it benefit them? Did it provide challenges? Hearing from older people themselves. So it's a qualitative study. So we interviewed 15 older adults aged 70 years and over living in the community. We did this through one of the aged care providers. The way that our system is structured, if you are receiving aged care support, it is administered through an aged care provider recognised by the government. And we were basically asking them about, what technologies they thought they were using in their everyday life. So it was, what do they understand by technology? What would you describe as what technologies do you think you use? Was that the data collection analysis followed the traditional, I would call it qualitative model of coding, comparisons, developed in categories, themes, independent coding between the researchers and so on. So it was very traditional qualitative data analysis and interpretation. Next slide, please. So our 15 participants, they were in the older age group. So 12 of the 15 aged over 75. But as I say, all living in the community, more women than men, which we would probably also expect. They were living in their own house or home, except for one who lived in a convent. And you may be curious why. The aged care provider, who was our partner in this, is actually a faith-based organisation, and they do have, some of their clients are actually nuns resident in a local convent, and was one of the nuns who volunteered to participate, hence the one living in a convent. The living arrangements, almost half living alone and the others with partner or partner and adult children, and one with a carer. The home care packages, this is the level of support they are receiving from the government. So level 1 is very basic support, meeting very basic needs, perhaps some home maintenance, perhaps assistance with gardening or cleaning, perhaps meals on wheels delivered to people, so very basic. And then as you go up the levels, the need is greater. So level 4 is the top level, higher needs. And this could be people living with major chronic conditions such as Parkinson's disease, dementia, etc. And as a bit of a rule of thumb, a level 4, somebody assessed as requiring level 4 support would receive a budget of around 50,000 Australian dollars a year to provide that support. Next slide, please. So from our interviews, what were the most common types of technologies? Once we sort of explained what we were looking at in terms of a technology or technologies. So we came up with a personal alarm. So for health and safety reasons, people had personal alarms, 10 of the 15. In terms of housing, a key thing was air conditioning. Now, that may seem a bit odd to some of you, but in a climate like Australia's, cooling is particularly important with our often hot and very long summers. And as we know, body temperatures may change as people age. So the air conditioning is important, just as heating may be in other parts of the world. So 11 of them had air conditioning available in their homes. 10 had an electric lifter chair, so for daily living, being comfortable, getting in and out safely of a chair. Television, which was the main form, if you like, of leisure activity within the home, was watching television, and that was the basic television set with the basic programs provided by local channels. We weren't into streaming or any of those other areas. In terms of mobility, maintaining mobility, 9 of the 15 had a wheeled walker, so did need that assistance to move around. And with the communication technologies, well, we very much think about, smartphones and all sorts of things. 13 of our participants were very dependent on what we call the landline phone, the old style phone where you pick it up and you may have to dial or press buttons or whatever for communicating with family, with friends, with medical services and whatever. They're very much dependent on a landline. Next slide, please. The meaning of technology, and here we have just some excerpts from the transcripts that we had. So it was all about the meaning of technology, keeping up with the present, keeping in touch with people, and that's why the phone, a basic landline, was very important for maintaining that sort of contact. Others saw a computer or an iPad as a matter of choice, maybe not. It wasn't sort of that important. The shower chair and the toilet seat, as much as we may be saying we've got to move beyond them, are very important because that is about physical safety. And of course, the personal alarm, the vital call, is very important. And then others, the meaning of technology, if they were not highly engaged with communication technologies, for example, they've expressed that as feeling a bit of a failure. Anyway, the impact here again are some quotes. Next slide, please. Just some quotes about how people feel about these technologies, the importance of them. We couldn't live without the computer, and that was one of our male participants because he kept a very close eye on his share portfolio and his retirement income. But it wasn't the case for all people. Next slide, please. This is an interesting comment from somebody who wanted to remain very socially and politically engaged, if you like. I'm in touch with a lot of social justice groups. And the way of doing that, because she could no longer physically get to rallies or meetings or whatever, she relied very much on a computer, iPad, etc., to maintain that contact, which, to her was a very, very important a component of her life. And if she wasn't physically able to do it, she was looking at other ways to maintain that contact. Next slide, please. These are just, again, some examples of the supports that may be needed. So using Siri, for example, as a way of using the technology to make the contact, relying on neighbours or family or friends. And then in this particular aged care provider, the technical support was available from the provider itself to those still living in the community. So if they had a problem with their computer, they could phone and get the technician to come up, which was quite important to them. Next slide, please. So in the just in terms of conclusions, these are the major conclusions: that people were using combined technologies, it was highly individualized, people liked or used different things. They definitely needed support from whether it was family, friends, or the technician. Most people valued what they had as a form of technology. And yes, it provided support to them in some ways, but they also needed support to use it. Quickly for study 2, next slide, please. This was informed our scoping review, some of the publications we have in a book chapter, basically looking at these key definitions, concepts related to digital technology and aging, who uses digital technologies, and particularly what was available around health and aging in place. Next slide, please. So this is just, of course, to us who are researching in this area, this is what we are familiar with, we talk about, we use, and so on. But a lot of this is just not familiar at all to people who are older, and whether they're in the community or where they're living. It just is not a language they're familiar with. Next slide, please. Do older adults use technology? Well, from the research we did, we're just contrasting the US and Australia here. And yes, older people, if we take 65 and over as being older, are using technologies. It does vary a little bit in terms of what they use them for. But again, it gave us a snapshot of what is reported about technology use. Next slide, please. So for the users, what influenced digital technology use, it was education level, if it was partnered, so that you had it in the family home. They were positive about the technology, they were satisfied with the technology, and they persevered. They were able to persevere with the technology. Next slide, please. For non-users, they saw no benefit, no interest. It was too challenging and difficult. For some, it was the cost of it. You do need income. You do need some resources. The anxiety around it. I feel pressure to use it, but I don't really know how to use it. And of course, for some with cognitive impairment, there were going to be some issues. Next slide. Thank you. So these are just some of our conclusions from our literature review. The use of technology in the sector is underdeveloped and fragmented. Mixed success for telehealth and telecare in many countries, including Australia. Just identifying the home-based technologies that can improve health outcomes, but are they used and how are they used we don't have a lot of evidence. Little research around the use of technologies, assistive digital for older people with dementia. And it must address identified need. Now, just quickly, the next slide, please. The key issues we have highlighted here that need a lot of attention and hopefully will get that attention. We hope to continue with our study. Next slide. And this is just a summary of what we believe is needed. And I think importantly, ensuring older people have choice, voice, and control in any discussion, any implementation, interventions with technologies. And we're looking to do a co-design with older people, with the aged care provider, and their staff to try and really work through what is needed here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. This was a really thought-provoking presentation, particularly around issues, of high-tech versus low-tech solutions. And you very convincingly presented that low-tech has indeed a role to play, and it will have to do so for some time to come. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there will be more time for questions in the end. I would now like to introduce to you our next speaker. That's Matthew Lariviere of the University of Bristol, who will give his presentation on aging in place, unsettling boundaries between home and community through design and provision of technology-enabled care in the UK. Matthew, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas, for that kind of introduction. Hello, I'm a lecturer in social policy at the University based in School for Policy Studies there. And today I'm going to talk to you about aging well technically, kind of how technology shapes care in later life. So next slide, please. So I think the first thing I want to talk about too is kind of provocation, which is asking, what do we mean by care? So often it is badged with another noun. So we're talking about social care, we're talking about health care, we're talking about veterinary care, if you want to talk about that, or child care as well. But I think crucially, what unifies all these kind of different systems and forms of practices is this kind of concept of care. So what has care meant historically, and how can it help us understand things theoretically when we think about the role of technology within it? Next slide, please. So here I've identified kind of three traditions of theorizing care based upon previous research from social sciences. This goes from kind of feminist studies, from philosophy, and also from social anthropology in particular, but also drawing upon philosophy of science and other cognitive disciplines as well. So the first work really emerged kind of in the latter half of the 20th century and focused on kind of feminist responses to how labor was initially viewed, right? So oftentimes focus on paid employment. However, feminist scholars responded that actually care is a form of work as well, right? So it's these activities used to support another person, whether it's unpaid work, but also now we're seeing increasingly emphasis of looking at the forms of care work, which is paid work, whether from people in adult social care services or healthcare, and how that is actually seen as care as a form of, therefore, labor and work in that way. Also, in response to these original critiques, there is an emergence of ethics of care, which is, again, focusing on this ethical responsibility one person has to support others. And this isn't just limited to humans, but also looking at how these actors have this responsibility to support non-human actors as well. So that can be animals. It can also be the environment as well. But it's about that support of supporting liveliness. And this is based upon what Gilligan calls caregivers' empathy, but also what Tronto and Fisher refer to as ideas about attentiveness, responsibility, competence, and responsiveness between this person who's caring for and the cared for person. And finally, more recently, we have the work of anthropologist Arthur Kleinman, who has been looking at this care as a moral experience, and he's written about extensively based upon his own work as a cultural psychiatrist in parts of East Asia, but also more recently, his work caring for his wife and his kind of reflective experiences of that. And for him, this care as a moral experience focuses on evocative sensibilities of caring based upon compassion, respect, and love, which is reciprocal and relational, and facilitated by kind of more tangible material aspects such as touch and being co-present, so located in the same spaces and places as other individuals as well. So I think these are kind of helpful ways of looking at the kind of myriad ways we have theorized care. I said we social scientists broadly, historically, and even into more recent times. Next slide, please. So what I suggest, though, is that despite the wide theoretical suggestions already proposed by social scientists, there are common dimensions of care, right? So there's this affective thing that's brought up in Arthur Kleinman's work, so the idea of love and respect. Also realizing that affect can also be negative emotions too, right? It can be stressful, it can be difficult providing care. Additional facet or dimension of care is this materiality, right? So that can be the physical labor of caring, as talked about with a lot of the first feminist kind of scholars' response to this. Also is the activities of caring for, perhaps mentioned by Gilligan, Tronto, and Fisher within their work, and that idea of touch and presence touched upon within Arthur Kleinman's work more recently too. Care is also relational, right? So this is tied to the idea of kith and kin relationships too. So our kind of family and other social network too, and the relationships that are formed through caring, but also reinforced through additional caring arrangements too. That's picked up again by the feminist scholarship who looked at care as this form of unpaid work, traditionally done within households and for family members, but also thinking about relational kind of in more kind of abstract conceptual ways. So just looking at how people are responding to or being accountable for their actions within caring as well. And finally, there's kind of this overall kind of goal or intended outcome related to caring as well, right? So this is the idea of being supportive in some way, whether it's to help achieve ideas about a good life or indeed death as well, or kind of more perhaps mechanistically think about enhanced well-being when it comes to looking at how care is formalized, commissioned, and provided within formal care systems. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you today about two different projects which have examined some of the ways in which technology has shaped practices of caring. The first one I'm going to talk to you is called Accommodate. Next slide, please. So Accommodate as we are wont to do in a lot of social and health sciences, is of course an acronym. The acronym stands for a collaborative, community-based ethnography of people with dementia and their carers using assistive technology and telecare in England. This was an embedded ethnography, which is a methodology which, in this case, examined practices of people with dementia and their caregivers, and predominantly family carers, but also some other, what we might call informal or unpaid carers too, so friends, neighbors, and supporting people with dementia as well. And look at how they use assistive technology and telecare with a national trial. This trial is called ATTILA, which is again another acronym standing for Assistive Technology and Telecare to Maintain Independent Living at Home for People with Dementia. This was led by Professor Rob Howard, formerly at King's College London, now at University College London. And so my role within this was to do kind of the qualitative research, which was this, again, this embedded ethnography methodology based upon spending prolonged periods of time with people with dementia and their family carers in the homes of people with dementia. So I spent 6 months with each case study for a total of 208 total hours of observations and interviews combined. So they were relatively unstructured observations, looking at kind of the everyday lives of people with dementia, and how the person and how the care cared for them, and indeed how, if and when this technology kind of became embedded into their activities, or why they chose not to embed it as well. So kind of exploring those through probing, through unstructured interviews, kind of more almost conversations instead of things, which help the person with dementia who didn't rely on kind of retrospective knowledge, which may be inhibited due to their cognitive problems. So by making it kind of this unstructured live questions, it made them more easy to respond to as well. Next slide, please. So what we did situational analysis of field notes and transcripts of these unstructured interviews. Situational analysis is a way of, unsurprisingly, analyzing situations, right? So this is examining both the built environment, spaces, the actors, and interactions within a specific time-defined context. So it's all about kind of drawing boundaries between where practices take place. And I was really interested in looking at the social practices of people with dementia and their family carers to understand how and why technologies, in this case assistive technologies and telecare products, were being used or not. Within our analysis, we identified kind of 3 broad themes from the 9 cases we had. And these really looked at how participants' practices with these technologies shaped care relations in their spaces. So these are placing care, replacing care, and displacing care. I'm not going to go into any in-depth look at any one of those particular things, but I'm going to look at one case study that kind of really illustrates the relationship between these different forms of placing care, replacing care, and displacing care. So placing care is about how with or through digital technologies, or in this case assistive technologies and telecare products, care arrangements became in place into different settings. Replacing care is kind of looking at that process of which the traditional forms of caring or caregiving slowly became replaced through the introduction and continued use of digital technologies and assistive products. And then finally, displacing care is actually a complete reversal. So now it's not just the caring being reshaped and reconfigured, it actually is tied to the spaces becoming reconfigured or indeed displaced as well. So suddenly care takes place in new places that were not intended originally to take place. Next slide. So kind of looking at the relationship between placing, replacing, and displacing forms of care, I'm going to talk about the Draper's case, which is one of the 9 case studies from this doctoral study. And in this, I really want to look at kind of how the spaces in this person's home, indeed just one room in the house, which is the person's lounge or living room, became reconfigured within it. And as a result of the reconfiguration of the different objects used to occupy it, and the different practices taken in it, the resulting abandonment in other spaces in that home too. And this kind of raises questions about how should we design and implement care technologies that adapt to the changing spaces and places of care in later life with dementia, right? So it's tied to that idea of aging in place, which is the theme for this session. But what does that mean? Is it just about person living at home, providing them to live in their home for as long as possible, but realizing that that home is not this static location. It is dynamic and ever-changing as well as it becomes settled and resettled in different ways. Next slide. So this is the first map here. I am not an artiste, but what this map is trying to indicate now is my first visit with the Draper family on September 20, 2015. The Drapers and their family name, the surnames here, and also their first names, Violet and Thomas, are pseudonyms as well, so things are fully anonymized. And during my first visit, you will notice that when you enter the room now, there's already not just the normal furniture you might see in a sitting room or lounge, but also a bed there as well. This is as a result of Violet, the person with dementia in this case, having had a very bad fall recently and can no longer go upstairs to her normal bedroom. So instead, the bed became placed within that sitting room environment. This changed the kind of not only how he viewed it and but also how she occupied that space as well, right? So it became a place for her hosting guests, including researchers like myself, but also it became a place where she slept and rested during the evening and other times of the day too. So you can already see a slight shift into how this space is occupied and the resulting practices tied to it as well. The only technology she was provided as part of this study were a calendar clock, which is a way of kind of helping to orientate her with the correct day and time. So she knows when it's 3 o'clock, it's 3 p.m. and not 3 a.m. So she's not calling her son, who is our primary carer, Thomas in this case. And also a pendant alarm, which is a really common piece of assistive technology. It's offered to many older adults who are considered frail or have an underlying condition like dementia. And it's something worn around the neck, or you can also get it as a form of wristwatch style device. It's a way of kind of helping to press a button if they need any emergency support. Some have a built-in fall detector as well that can detect if they have fallen as well, which hers did not. Hers was just a basic pendant worn around the neck with a button. Next slide, please. So this is the same room now. We see it's January 2016. So this is 4 months later, just past the halfway point of my study with this particular case. And one thing that happened in December of 2015 was, unfortunately, Violet had another bad break. A bad fall, sorry, resulting in both of her legs being broken and being hospitalized. When I actually went to visit in January 2016, Thomas, her son, still met with me, but she actually was still in hospital at that point in time, getting ready to be transferred into residential care for a bit of rehabilitation before eventually moving home. They tried to move her home at one point in time before putting her into the residential care unit, and which is why there is a commode now in the room, as well as all the other furnishings that were present from it as a sitting room. It's still a bedroom as well too. So with the introduction of commode, you're now seeing the sitting room kind of take on this quasi aspect of being a bedroom for the bed, but also now became a place where she toilets as well. So this is a place where she is doing all of her entertaining when she was physically there, resting and sleeping as well, but also now where she has to do personal care activities like toileting as well. Now, of course, what you're not seeing as a result of this is that as a result of all these technologies and objects being placed into this room, all the other rooms, her bedroom, the living rooms, as a result of all this too, right? So it's displacing these kind of everyday forms of caring that are present in our life. Next slide, please. And here you will see the result of a final visit in April 2016. This was delayed due to issues with accessing and meeting up with Thomas and with Violet as well. Unfortunately, in the intervening months, actually in March of that year, they made a decision for Violet to be moved permanently into residential care. I was able to visit, again, just Thomas this time in April 2016 to understand what had happened, the decision to place Violet permanently into residential care, and to understand what the consequences on those decisions too. And this was where that final meeting took place, was in that same sitting room location. And now you'll see that there's a hospital-style bed there, an electric bed there. There's still the commode, still a fireplace, and some boxes from other things too. But all the actual equipment that made that space originally that sitting room has been completely replaced, right? It's not there. Thomas actually was emptying the house in order to sell it to help pay for his mother's residential care costs. So it shows how actually this idea of home-based care is not something that is settled. It is something that is constantly resettled and unsettled. And there's an ongoing process of negotiation there. Next slide, please. And so this is what kind of some of the key takeaways really are from the accommodative study, right? So care practice initially went from being co-located by the carer, the person they are caring for, through face-to-face interactions, right? And then suddenly, through the intervention of technologies and also the kind of deterioration and progression of people's dementia symptoms, these became displaced, increasingly mediated through different apps and screens. And other care practices often became rendered invisible, even though the objects associated with them, like commodes, may have been very present and visible in their own right. The focus on technology meant the actual caring roles became very kind of invisible to discussions and observations. And tied to this idea, this really problematizes the idea of living independently in the community, a prevalent discourse in technology-enabled care systems and service thinking, and the idea that rather than actually promoting independence, it focuses on new forms of dependency, interdependency even, between the person with dementia and their carer. People with dementia really left their home, and carers reconfigured the spaces within the home to meet these kind of shifting care needs of the person with dementia as he experiences a range of different symptoms that progressed as the person's dementia advanced as well. And it shows actually that when you're evaluating assistive technologies and telecare products, you need to keep in mind about how these technologies are actually fitting within the everyday routines, environments, and interactions and care practices of individuals. And that aging in place may be a euphemism for understanding how people live at home, but when we think about policy and we think about better practice goals, we need to be more specific about realizing that, again, these domestic environments, people's homes, are not these static locations. They are unsettled and resettled through a continuing process to meet these care needs, and policy and practice needs to recognize those kind of nuances going forward. Next slide, please. And then the next study I'm going to talk about is ASAP, which is the more recent study I completed at the University of Sheffield immediately before joining the University of Bristol. This was a fellowship I had funded by ESRC. Next slide, please. So as I said, this was the last study I completed. ASAP, of course, again, is an acronym, stands for Accelerating Implementation and Uptake of New Technologies to Support Aging in Place. So again, the Aging in Place thread is still conceptually joining my work. It was a link to the ESRC Large Grant Sustainable Care, of whom Professor Sue Yendall is the principal investigator. And it was a similar methodology to what I did with Accommodate, still very ethnographically focused there, but it's much more collaborative and is a form of participatory action research done in collaboration with partners from industry, policy, and provider organizations. And when I say providers, I mean housing and social care providers within adult social care systems. And it really focuses explicitly on exploring the challenges, opportunities of technology-enabled care ecosystem. So this is the whole range of different stakeholders, but also the different organizations involved in it and how they are joined together in some sort of system itself. And also, kind of more critically from the social science perspective, the social imaginaries about the roles of technology for aging studies and care, and how we kind of perceive that, and how those perceptions and imaginaries drive our actions for creating, designing, and implementing technologies within the space. Next slide, please. So very briefly, the key findings from ASAP on design and uptake of relevance for the aging in place theme session was looking at differences in how technologies and what technologies indeed were being provided. So we had originally this idea of standalone products. As you saw from Accommodate, it was pendant alarms, calendar clocks, medication carousels, a wide range of different products, but each one was its own standalone product. Now we're seeing kind of this shift from housing and care providers providing curated systems, oftentimes in concert with technology providers. So technology providers will not just provide a single product, but it'll be a range of different products that are curated into a package for people. Tied to this new shift towards curated systems, we're seeing increasingly blurred distinctions between care and consumer or mainstream products, what I want to call them. As other people have talked about in this session as well, this has been a range of things like the Alexa and other kind of products we are with consumers, but now are being offered by local authorities or their technology provider partners as well. So it really raises questions conceptually, first of all, about what do we mean by care technologies, right? And when does a consumer technology become a care technology? Which, of course, will then have implications for how it is commissioned, how it's provided, who pays for it, and also, importantly, how it's regulated and the implications for data protection, access, and the kind of ethical, social justice, non-exploitation of these devices as well, and how it affects people's lives. Another thing that emerged from this, after talking with designers, especially from research predominantly, is a limited understanding about experiences of care in later life. This is often due to the situation where people may not have user involvement in forming the design and implementation of their products and services. And even when it comes to new startups who largely have been started by young white males, they are not often the demographics who will have experiences personally of aging. And usually, since again, care work is usually still very gendered, performed by women, not have experiences as caregivers either. So it is these limitations which, of course, will impact on how people design and develop care technologies for an older population. Another issue within thinking about design and uptake of technologies is housing and care providers are also incredibly unfamiliar at times with new technology products. They often kind of focus on keeping up with the latest trends. So, they hear a lot about predictive analytics and artificial intelligence more predominantly in social care and housing. They don't necessarily know what technologies are available that have those features, or more importantly, how using those technologies will actually help them achieve their organizational goals, right? So the focus often is on having the newest and latest product, rather than about how will this product help me provide good quality housing that is effective cost-wise for our clients and residents, but also make sure that we're sustainable as an organization too, right? It's more focused on the need to be seen as being innovative using emerging technologies, rather than think about how those technologies factor into their business plans and service offerings. And this ties to another ongoing issue within adult social care more broadly, which is how we evaluate technologies often focuses on health outcomes and not on these housing, care, or well-being kind of outcomes instead. So we need metrics which account for care and well-being based upon those dimensions I mentioned before, the affective, material, subjective, and supportive elements that are focused on caring, not focused on does technology reduce hospitalizations? Does it reduce people's use of GP services? Because, of course, it is not designed to do so. It is meant to focus on how these technologies can support people within their own home environments or in housing provided by other providers. Next slide, please. So to kind of discuss both these things more broadly than now, what I argue, and indeed this is a argument brought forward by Verbeek and other colleagues from philosophy of science as well, is that technologies can be seen as actors in their own right. They are imbued with moral agency, which helps to mediate how we, as humans, engage with and perceive our world around us, right? So this idea that technology mediates how we view things. The fact that we're doing this all online right now as a conference shows that technology mediates our lives, how we share knowledge, and inform other scholars and policymakers within this field of social care. However, there are concerns with the continued preoccupation with current care technology, and it risks increased focus on health, if we're measuring it only based on health-related outcomes, and risks an increased focus on surveillance and how we are monitoring people, whether it's older people, carers, or the care workforce, and indeed also emphasis on risk management and how can we reduce or alleviate risk rather than think about traditional forms of care and caring and how to actually want to live their lives in later life as well. This could in turn lead to reconfiguring how we perceive care. Indeed, also therefore how we commission it, right? What we deem as priority areas and prioritize technologies associated to enhance or enable those areas of caring, as opposed to the everyday care activities people want to do and desire in their goals, which may become undervalued or further created or further invisible. And I suppose what I'm saying then, therefore, is we don't just develop technology. We don't just develop care technologies. We're developing potentially new ways of understanding and practicing care when we develop these technologies because of how it mediates our everyday lives. Next slide. So, as a final kind of takeaway, one of the last things I did at the University of Sheffield before I joined the University of Bristol is I did an exhibition with artists based locally to look at what could the future of care look like. And this was part of a Sheffield Carescapes project funded by the University of Sheffield. By working with local artists, we want to move beyond that kind of discourse of care in crisis to examine illustrations, depictions of what could care look like if we got it right. What could it look like if we had just technology usage? What could it look like if we had a valued and paid for care workforce? And here you'll see the work of Rob Richardson, one of the artists involved, to look at kind of the ubiquity of technology and some of these features here, right? And I think actually some of these are very prescient given what happened with COVID-19 and how technology further mediated our lives as well. So we have here the idea of celebrating birthdays via, online video calls. So that was very real for many people this past year. It will be for the foreseeable future as well. Next slide, please. And we also have this slide here as well, this illustration again by Rob, looking at the potential of robotics within caring for people too. We really want to play with the idea of how a lot of robots within kind of speculative fiction, so science fiction predominantly, often looks menacing. But just because it looks menacing doesn't mean it can't be having a very helpful role. So this kind of arthropod insect-like robot here may look quite menacing, something from our deepest, darkest nightmares, but you see it's helping a person make their lunch right now, right? So the woman off to, in the background there, is preparing, getting ready for the day, and here this robot is helping prepare meals. So, I think it's important that when we're thinking about the future technology within caring for each other and how caring becomes shaped by technologies, we have very forward-thinking ideas and discussions about what we want it to look like, what we want it to feel like in the future. Next slide. And those are just my references. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matthew. This was really a fascinating talk you gave, and I look forward to the many questions people will ask you afterwards. It's now time to introduce our discussant, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you Obert Tawodzera, who is a PhD student from the University of Sheffield, working with Sue Yendel and colleagues at Circle. Welcome, Obert, and he kindly volunteered to discuss the three papers you just heard. So, Obert, the floor is now yours, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, our speakers. That was really some fascinating talk. First, let me also thank the organizers for inviting me to offer some comments and reflection as a way to kickstart our collective discussion around the opportunities and barriers in using technologies in place-based care context. I can say it's an honor and a privilege, especially after such an impressive panel, which has delivered a very illuminating and thought-provoking talk. I'll try to do justice to the brilliance of the panelists by bringing in a few salient points. The common theme that ran through all the three papers that have been presented today was that technology has the potential to successfully address our social and aging needs, and that older people may benefit from using technologies, allowing them to independently monitor their health, or to create and maintain social networks, to stay in contact with friends and family, despite sometimes the distance that could be caused by many various things, for example, migration. Most importantly, I can say from the presentation, they've actually illuminated the technological use of the people who are mainly at a greater risk of being left behind. In the case of Tanya's presentation, those who are being at risk of being left behind when their children migrate overseas, that is the elderly. It also would be a case with older people in general, as has been presented by Kate, or with those who are actually developing a cognitive decline, or having dementia, as Matthew's paper is shown. Of course, the literature normally presents the literature normally presents the technologies as the holy grail, and we know that it is the most preferred way of using the most preferred way of using technologies is that it allows older people to age in place or to live independently at home, rather than being taken to institutions. And this is widely recognized in the literature, and also in policy and practice, as Kate has indicated. We know definitely from the literature that these technologies have been shown to have a greater potential, especially in fostering independent living, improving health and mental and physical health, and also increasing most probably the quality of life for the elderly. Kate's presentation, to begin with, actually demonstrated that despite these technologies playing a significant role in the successful intervention of elderly people living at home, there is actually less, or there is limited adoption when it comes to older people, and this is especially with the new digital technologies, and we see that older people, they want to remain using the old sort of like technologies that they grew up knowing. So normally, like from the presentation Kate gave, we see that what is the most common type of technology that older people prefer using is things like the landline, the air conditioners, and the wheeled walkers. And perhaps I can say we can look deeper into this as a collective, and try and understand why. Perhaps one thing that struck me is probably will come with how do we define technology? What's the real definition of technology? What is it that we call a technology? In my work, I normally use the word new technologies because I try to use the new digital technologies. My line of work, which is also in line with Tanya's presentation, where we look at how ICTs are helping people to maintain care relationships at a distance. Of course, technology cannot be used as a singular sometimes. Maybe we might want to go beyond using it as a singular and try to think of it as technologies, use it in plural rather. Why, you might want to ask? I would say because these definitions vary, because if we want to stay trying to define them, we might end up being at each other's throat, because these definitions vary, and sometimes technologies are used synonymously with tools or machines, or from the presentations that we've had from commodes, like Matthew's presentation, probably air conditioners, wheeled walkers, landlines and up to mobile phones, things like ICTs and digital technologies. Back to my point, we see from Kate's presentation that older people, they do not necessarily adopt these new technologies at a higher pace than we would expect in a more technologically advanced societies, especially given the examples of Australia and the USA. That's in Kate's second study, where we find that in Australia, only 15% Australians elderly use the digital technologies for health and medical services. It might be very important here to ask Kate a question. I would like to hear more from you, Kate, regarding this adoption of especially these digital new technologies by older people in your research. I would want to ask, what were the reasons behind the lack of adoption, especially for new technologies, the new digital technologies? Do old people actually prefer more conservative kind of technologies that they grew up using, for example, the landline, as opposed to new upcoming technologies like smartphones or like asynchronous technologies? Equally, I could also extend this question also to you, Tanja, to try and understand maybe the difference here, because we know this is India might be a different context, and Kerala, for example, that where your study site was, also include some rural parts of India, and would also want to know, maybe in a different context, how the adoption of these new technologies is actually taken in by people from different contexts. In your also want to know what actually drove adoption of these new technologies. Did older people in Kerala also use landlines, or did they prefer mobile phones, and what was the reasons for that? Because we have to understand how these technologies actually work, and in understanding that, we also need to bring in context, and in this case, context is very, very important. This also brings me to the issue that's been discussed by Matthew, trying to look at technologies in our homes, how we are bringing in these technologies into our homes, and trying to not trying to, but bringing those technologies into our homes is actually institutionalizing the care and support of older people into the home, like we are now bringing it into the home. Matthew's presentation actually shows how new assistive telecare technologies may penetrate the private space of home, and changing not only the physical environment, but also one's relationship with that physical environment. So the places and spaces we live in, we know that they've got history, they've got meaning, and sometimes they hold some sentiments and memories, or which again could be disturbed, especially if a new technology is brought into it. Also took part in a study with the sustainable care, where we looked at older migrants in the UK and their adoption of and telecare technologies. And from that study, we found that actually older people, they were resistant to these new technologies actually coming into their home. And the reason why they were resistant was that it changed their environment. Maybe sometimes if they needed to fit a new lift, that means something has got to give in, or maybe a space in their house has got to be taken out so that the lift could be fitted. And that led to a lot of people saying that they don't want that in their homes. So actually, so by bringing in these assistive technologies in the environment we live in, we actually risk turning the home into an institution. And then in these circumstances, we also need to ask ourselves to what extent do we adopt the environment in order to facilitate the use of technologies, especially for older people, or especially for people with dementia, for example. We also need to remember that in applying these assistive technologies, sometimes it is in someone else's environment, and we need to proceed with caution, as Matthew's presentation has shown, that if it's a person with dementia who may not be able to apprehend these changes, so we need really to act with precaution. Matthew's presentation also brought in into the discussion a very important and often something that we normally forget to tie to these technologies when we are discussing them, and that is the concept of care, actually, which is really important in trying to bring the how technologies and care intersect. If we employ, for example, the ethics of care framework, the ethics of care framework, which actually emphasizes the importance of a relationship between those being cared for and those caring. This might prompt some actually difficult questions, which we might want to ask ourselves in regards to the use of technology. Does this technology enhance the social practice of caring, and does it bring people together in interdependency, as we know, or does it disturb the whole care arrangement process that we know, which we need for bringing in the good and quality care to our elderly? So for Matthew, I would want to ask, like in your presentation, from your study, do these technologies represent a shift actually in the way in which care is practiced? And I would also bring back Tanya into this question, where it might be really helpful to ask some questions here. Tanya, you talked about what is good care, and understanding what is good care, and trying to marry that with the use of technologies is really important here. So my question here is, does migration and new technologies create new care arrangements for the elderly in India? Because you, like I said before, your presentation and your study actually dovetail my PhD study, where I also looked at the role of new technologies in mediating long-distance aged care relationships between UK-based migrants and their overseas family members. I'm not sure how remote Kerala, India is, but in my study, I found that those with parents who lived in remote areas of my research site, which was Zimbabwe, actually, they actually have limited use of these new technologies, or using mobile phones, tablets, and stuff like that. And people in those remote areas don't even have a network, and this actually brings in the technological divide between the UK and Africa. So without wasting much of your time, and actually also posing these questions to the audience, I would also want to know, Tanya, how your participants, the nurses, the Indian nurses, how did they help with the diffusion of telehealth and assistive technologies to their home countries? Did they actually learn something in their places of work that they took over to India? And did the older people in India adopt these technologies? And how did they adapt to using them? So these are some of the questions that I have for our panel, and also for everyone else. And feel free to also ask me questions regarding also my study, or from this discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Obert, for your very thoughtful and insightful reflection. I think you have given us quite a bit to chew on, and I would like to add to your question towards Anya some reflection of my own. Anya was describing implicitly a concept called distance caregiving, which is becoming more and more important. And what strikes me is that about 15 or 20 years ago, people would have said, this is not care. I mean, it's people talking with each other over a long distance. That's something that is part of maintaining a social network, that's social contacts, but it's not care. But nowadays, that seems to change, and the next generation seems to have a different concept of caregiving. So they consider, or we consider this as providing care, as caregiving. And these intergenerational differences in the perception of care, I think that's something very important to consider as well. So not only does the need in care provision and the means of providing care change over time, but also the perception what is care, what is caregiving does change over time. So thank you very much to all of you listening to these three fascinating presentations, and also to Obert's final comments. We are now looking forward to your questions and comments, and I look forward to a intense and thoughtful discussion with all of you out there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Obert. I think you raised some good points there. And actually, I think you did a good job kind of succinctly summarizing some of the key findings from particularly the accommodative study as well. You're right. One of the kind of outcomes of this reconfiguring of these domestic spaces is kind of these institutionalization at home, which previous scholars have defined as exstitutionalism. So again, it's this idea of institutionalizing things, but in external environments from formal institutions, whether it's prisons, schools, residential care homes, within our context, of course, as well. So it is this institutionalization of the home, which creates kind of ways of monitoring people at home. And as you said, it kind of penetrates that private space of home, which of course is already happening even without technologies as well, right? So when care workers go into a person's home environment, yes, for that person who resides there, it is their home, which is a private space. But for their care worker, it is their place of employment, right? So it's already kind of this semi-permeable, blurred boundary between how the home becomes a public-private kind of hybrid of spaces. And as you mentioned, these places and spaces therefore are imbued with different meanings and sentiments, which again, I think really plays through with who is occupying those spaces and how they're occupying them. Again, for the person with dementia and their carer who may have grown up in that home, if it's their parent, it could be their child at home as well, that space has very particular meaning in how they make sense of their relationship to it, and how that, of course, their relationship becomes unsettled with that space, and through those spaces, relationships with that technology, their care arrangements, and of course, their familial relationships as well, all changing as well. And of course, people like care workers coming in as well have a different relationship, right? As well as formalized through contracts and employment. And their relationship, therefore, with those spaces is also quite different as well, seeing it as a space of working rather than necessarily a form of this kind of more effective form of caring, which Climate may have mentioned as well. So respond to your question precisely asked me, do technology represent a shift in how technology and how care is practiced? I think one thing important to think about very clearly is technology has always infused our care practices, right? When we say technology within this theme broadly, what we really mean is kind of digital computerized technologies, right? Whether they're the old social alarms from the 60s into modern day, like pendant alarms, or whether they are new forms of technology like robotics apps for smartphones and tablets, predictive analytics, AI. As opposed to technologies which are things like cups, plates, things that help us eat, right? These are all objects. These are all human artifacts, which therefore are all technologies writ broadly. But of course, technology, as it mediates our everyday lives and our relationship to the world around us, and therefore the environments, the people who inhabit these spaces too, it is necessarily going to change how we practice care, how we think about policy, and how we kind of formalize these arrangements within systems. I think that's why it's so crucial to focus on the conceptual underpinnings of these technologies, right? If they are going to use that kind of name we use in England, which is technology-enabled care services, then what is the care element they are enabling, right? Is it tied to this idea of care as work, which in that case is the technology meant to support the carer or the care worker who's doing this either paid or unpaid form of emotional and physical labor? Is it meant to tie to their relationship, kind of more focusing on kind of Toronto and Fisher's work and Gilligan's work about the relational aspects of caring? In that case, how's it being evaluated to do so? Or do we want technology to focus more on kind of the sensibilities that the client mentioned? You know, is it about kind of being able to feel present in a person's life, being able to facilitate touch when possible, being able to focus on compassion and love? And if so, technology will be designed quite differently from that. I think this is one of the challenging things when it comes to how we think about care and the role of technology to support caring. Is caring means so much in English in particular as a language, right? And of course, formalized in systems in Anglophone countries like Canada, like the UK, like Australia, like New Zealand, and like the United States. Care refers to both the ubiquitous forms of everyday care, the kin work that a lot of feminists mentioned in the latter 20th century, but also these very formalized, specialized systems of caring, like adult social care, like housing, like health services as well. Technology has an opportunity potentially to join up those understandings, but also may have the consequence of reframing them entirely. And one of the things I am concerned about is the increasing emphasis of monitoring systems, activity monitoring systems, surveillance technologies, which are now permeating people's homes, whether that home is a private home or is a room within a residential care environment. But by focusing on technologies which only do monitoring, what Toronto and Fisher would call caring about, we're missing out on the other aspect of their definition for ethics of care, which is the caring for, that more relational, tangible, material forms of caring as well. People still need to have meals prepared for them, still need help with eating, still need help getting dressed, washed, and toileting. If we focus on technologies which survey and monitor, are we missing out on those very critical instrumental care tasks as well? I think we need to look at the limitations of technology now, and if we want to focus on technology having a very strong emphasis and priority in future care arrangements, make sure technology can either address those additional aspects of caring, the cared for aspects, or indeed just continue to recognize its limitations and the need for humans to be key deliverers of care now and into the future.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. There was, yes, indeed, a lot that I can address. So first of all, where to start? Let's start with the technologies, how to define technologies. Well, my former supervisor, Jeanette Bowles, she was my supervisor for this project, which I did as my PhD research. She actually writes about the idea that there's no such thing as technology. There are only different technologies, and each of them has its own affordance and interferes with how people relate to each other differently. So yes, I definitely agree with your idea about different kinds of technologies. There's also this notion of new technologies versus old technologies, and some people would say, well, smartphones and such things are not even new anymore. We're all familiar with them and so on. But it depends on the time, the scope in which you are making this comparison, right? Because in the scope of humanity, these technologies are very, very, very new. we like to think of them as not new because they're so ingrained in our everyday life. So, we think of them as, it's just a part of it. They've become a part of us. But that's the tricky part, I think, because even though we use them every day, we are also forced to use them every day now. But we don't actually know how they impact our identities and the way we relate to each other in detail. The smallest changes that they do to how we talk to each other and how we understand each other. And this also this speaks to the idea of what is care, the definition of care, and so on. And it's true. When I started looking at telemedicine and e-health and so on, people said, "Oh, the doctors and the nurses and the patients, they don't want to use these technologies. They need the touch and so on." But in the case of my study participants, well, they said, well, they didn't have much choice, right? It's difficult to find employment in Kerala, so a lot of people become nurses in order to migrate abroad, in order to take care of their parents. So they effectively only can become carers for their parents once they migrate abroad, which means that there's this whole reconceptualization of migration, not as abandonment, but care for the elderly parents. So that's the first step. And then the whole technology becomes included. And that's why I suggest the notion of transnational care collectives, which is a new way of thinking about what care is and how technologies co-create that kind of care. They shape it in particular ways. I also want to mention that it's not just about time, it's also about, so it's not about reconceptualizing care in terms of time or through time, but also through the way of living. So there are still tensions between families who have members abroad and are kind of forced also into this kind of distance caring, and the families who don't have family members abroad. So they still define care or good care differently. Do you see what I mean? Andreas, I can see you think about it. So the people who are still living in the non-transnational families, they still think about good care as primarily living together with the parents and sharing food and doing this kind of practices that demand physical proximity, whereas the transnational families are resisting this discourse and saying, well, if my children lived here and they had no job, they had no money, would we all be happy? Of course not. So, there are also still tensions there. I want to bring that to the idea of the ethics of care, and how to speak about good care and bad care. Now, I adopt the approach of STS, which is more about not so much about the ethics of care, which is about coming up with this universal guidelines of what is good care that are kind of abstract and philosophical. So I try to move that towards the empirical ethics, which is all about all about how the good is achieved through everyday tinkering, through everyday practices. So if you think about the chronic illnesses, right? In illnesses, the good care is about finding cure. But with chronic illnesses, this is not possible. The cure is not going to be achieved. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to live as good a life with chronic disease as possible. And you do that through daily tinkering, which includes people and also different kinds of technologies and objects and institutions and so on. To link that to back to, I guess, to migration and technologies, does migration care create new care arrangements in India? Well, the Transnational Care Collective is a new care arrangement. So that is what I'm trying to say with my presentation. But also, it's true that technologies don't exist by themselves. They also need the infrastructure. So, for example, if the state or if the national government, instead of, for example, throwing so much money at telemedicine and e-health as such, maybe just try to fix the basic infrastructure first, so that people have the landlines and the Wi-Fi and so on. So the basic infrastructure that could also be taking care of transnational care collectives and of providing elder care in the next step. So you also asked about the telecare in Kerala. So is there any spillover about technologies from abroad to India? Not really. Not in terms of this specialized telecare technologies at all. What the families do, what the nurses abroad do, they pay for Wi-Fi for the parents in Kerala. They pay for the mobile devices, and those are most often very simple mobile phones, but also landline phones, indeed. And that was it. So they also would provide smartphones and tablets and computers, but not highly specialized other health technologies. And you also asked about what kind of technologies they adopt. As I said, they do have landlines, the elderly parents. Sometimes the parents even didn't know the phone numbers of their children abroad, because the children were calling them through internet-based platforms to save money, so the parents didn't even know where to call. So it was really up to the children to call them. But you know what actually drove the adoption of new technologies the most? Grandchildren.
Of course.
So when there were grandchildren abroad, and that was specific to grandmothers, not so much to grandfathers, but
Of
grandmothers were those who wanted to be in touch with their grandchildren, and that made them go crazy about learning, getting the laptops and learning how to use them. And they went at great lengths also to be able to use them, and they had to face actually a lot of discrimination in terms of age and gender. They were told all the time, "Who are you, this old woman? What do you need to know the laptop? Why do you need to know how to use this? It's not for you anyway." So they struggle with this a lot, but this was the greatest motivation. So I'll end with this, and I took quite a bit of time. But thank you so much for these questions; they were wonderful.
And thank you so much for your very insightful and extended comments and deliberations on that. Thank you, Tanja.
Kate, I also had a question for you, if I may.
Yes, please.
So I was also wondering, in my example, care was always not so much about individual people, but it was more about the family. So I was wondering if you also managed to speak to the relatives of the elderly people, and to see if they had any reactions to these technologies, and how the technologies also supported them, not just the elderly people. And I was also wondering if I find it really striking when you said, I find it, I was not that surprised that the elderly didn't have this vocabulary that is often used in telemedicine and e-health, like, you had a whole list of words that the elderly are not really familiar with or want to use, and so on. So I was just wondering if there has already been any reaction from policymakers and technological designers and so on to hear that the elderly people don't have that vocabulary. And is there perhaps a more general or planned integration of care through collaboration with the elderly?
Well, thank you for those questions. I have to say the COVID-19 pandemic has changed things quite a bit. And our data, that pilot study was done prior to 2018-19, because we created, the only way we could communicate with our doctors, with our family, during lockdowns, was through whatever communication we could possibly find. I just know in my own experience, I have my GP it's like a 5-minute walk away, but we were not allowed to go. We had to phone and have a consultation over the phone. So I think that has changed. Just going back, no, we haven't spoken to family, because as I said, this was the pilot study, speaking to the older people themselves. But we did speak to the staff at the aged care provider, or particularly the woman in charge there. And it's very interesting, the role of the family when it comes to technology. It's the one time that the family become very involved in how they might spend the personal budget that's been allocated to the parent, so on. And just as a backdrop to this, with this new funding model we have, the consumer-directed care and these personal budgets, the amount you will get depending on need, technology is specifically mentioned as one of the areas that the budget, you can spend your budget on. And this has, so we're interested in, well, how have health professionals responded to it? Because they're interacting with old people, they're referring them for services and whatever. So we want to know, how are they using technology or technologies to support people to remain aging in place, living in the community, given that if they have the level of home care package they have, they can spend it on technologies. Healthcare professionals are very slow to respond to this, but family members are very quick to respond. And the manager at the aged care provider said one of their biggest problem areas is where the family try to intervene when it comes to technology. So it will be, my mother needs an iPad. Now, the mother hasn't asked for the iPad, but the family members are. And then very often they will purchase the iPad and then it will go to the grandchild. They will buy the iPad out of their budget, but then it's really not for them, it's for the grandchild. And it's the same with other areas of home maintenance or whatever. So the family are not all involved in this way, but it's created a little bit of a problem area for the providers who are managing these clients and the way, accounting for the way they spend their budget that's allocated to them. So it's an interesting one. You mentioned about the grandchildren. That is a great motivation here as well. They will say, well, I really want to communicate with my grandson or granddaughter. They're now at university, so they've moved away, and they don't want to call the landline number. So I would like to have the iPad or the computer so we could, and they will set it up for me, and therefore we can talk to each other and see each other. Obert asked about the low percentage using the digital technologies, and in our own small sample, they all, or most of them had the landline. About 4 of them had a smartphone of the 15. The rest of them had a mobile phone, but one that the family had given them and they were supposed to take with them when they went up, but they didn't bother because they didn't really know how to use it. So they had a mobile phone. They could show you a mobile phone, but they really had no idea how to use it, or who paid the bill, or did it have credit on it, or anything like that. But as I said, 3 or 4 of them had a smartphone, and that was quite important to them to have that sort of access. I think again, it all gets back to definitions. So we talk about everyday technologies, we talk about assistive technologies, we talk about digital technologies. Andreas mentioned low tech, high tech. We use these distinctions quite freely, but you have that conversation with a person in their 70s or 80s. And when we said, well, anything around your house that you think is of assistance to you, we would call that a form of a technology. It's some form of, oh, really, And then they became a bit fascinated by this, but they don't identify the everyday objects as a form of technology. So it is a language thing, it is a definitional thing, and at times we are really like literally not on the same wavelength linguistically or the way we think when and so when we're talking about the allied health professionals, well, why aren't you introducing these possible technologies, whether it's for safety or maintaining a health condition, or whether it's for social engagement, maintaining communication with friends and family? It's like, well, is that what we have to do? Is that our job to do that? So this is what we're particularly interested in looking at it from the health professional point of view, bringing in the family, bringing in the staff at this aged care providers, because they also can facilitate this process. But it is a bit of it still can be quite a bewildering world for some older people, not everybody. That's probably a long way around to answer the question, so I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Kate and Tanja, sorry. Obert, you asked a few questions. Did Kate and Tanja answer your questions, or how do you feel about that?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Kate, thank you, Tanja. Yes, you've addressed the questions that I've asked, and yeah, I am. I now have an idea exactly from what you've told me now, and also I just want to kind of again, because what is more important now, which is really something that I think would help with us with talking more about these technologies, is the issue of the COVID-19 pandemic, like you've already said, because in the case of Tanya's presentation in your study is similar to mine when I was doing my study with Zimbabwean migrant care workers and their families back home. When I went to the families back home, and because mine was a multi-sited as well, I also went to Zimbabwe to talk to their families and ask them about how do they see this type of care that they receive, which is the virtual care. And at first, the parents were more like, we don't understand what you're talking about. What do you mean that is care? It's just something that someone calls me or do something like that. And trying to sort of like make them believe that actually when someone is calling you, their care was something that was really difficult. I think this is something which has got to do with the traditional way that care and caregiving are seen in Africa, where you've got to be proximate, you've got to be living together, you've got to be doing things together. But the pandemic, of course, has changed everything. Now, of course, when I had a chat with some of my participants post-pandemic, because I did also my study before the pandemic, that what are your thoughts now that with your parents back home, given that these technologies are becoming more important now because of this pandemic? They were actually saying, yeah, now it's more becoming very important. And this was not only for the long distance care or the transnational care that me and Tanja study, but it's now becoming more even salient for our own everyday living, even for those people who didn't believe at first that you need to harness these technologies for care. And I was doing one lecture with some students in my in one of the modules that I teach, and I was asking them about that, how they now see talking to their parents on the phone as a way of care. And actually, the response was really impressive. That such that they now say, we didn't think at first that that was a form of caring, but now if I have to call my grandmother because I can't go and see her at the care home that she is in, calling her and seeing her, probably using the webcam, Skyping, and using any other video conferencing tools, it really helps. I feel like I'm there. I feel like I'm caring for them. I can tell if they are happy. They become happy when they see me. It feels like I am there. And these were some of the things that some of us who've been who studied these transnational care arrangements and how people care at a distance have been actually trying to talk about. And the only danger that I actually see in this is that when it comes to things like migration, is actually policymakers would use that and try to restrict migration of people, because they can say you can use technology. So there's no point of you probably bringing your grandmother to come and look after your children. They can have a conference call or something like that. So yeah, it's just some food for thought in this conversation. But,
thank you all very much for your contributions to this fascinating session. And I think we kind of had another joint presentation in the end with all of us joining into a fascinating discussion on, well, how does care change in interaction with technology, and how does it change the concept of caregiving? And it's a shame we have to stop here, because now in the end we touched upon the most pressing issue. Well, literally everybody on this planet has to come to terms with and has to cope with, and that's COVID-19. And I'm sure it will change our concepts of caregiving, especially distance caregiving, for the coming years. And I would like to end this session with saying, please stay well, get your vaccine, and we see each other and hopefully meet each other in presence in the not too distant future. Thank you all, and see you soon.